Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Divorce Differently podcast. This is the final episode of our special series of divorce talks with Irwin Mitchell. We wanted to end with a bang by bringing together three leading family law partners from top city law firms to discuss the power of lawyer collaboration in divorce. This is what happens when divorce isn't treated as a battle between two sides, but as a shared problem to solve. So we're going to explore the real value for clients when their lawyers know each other, trust each other, and have a history of working collaboratively to reach agreements out of court. Because when both legal teams are aligned around one goal, finding fair, workable solutions, the process can become faster, less costly, and far less emotionally draining. My guests today are the lovely Kate.Clark, partner and head of family at Mishcon Reya, Rachel.Donald, partner, mediator, and collaborative lawyer at Mills Reeve, and Fran.hipperson, partner and head of the London family team at Irwin Mitchell. Ladies, thank you so much for joining me today. It's great to have you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Chloe.
Thanks for having us.
Such an interesting topic. And I know that you all know each other and you have lots of experience working together. And that's exactly what I want to tap into. Maybe, Fran, you could start. Could you tell us a little bit about how having lawyers who know each other and who've already worked together benefits clients in practice?
I think, as you've already referred to, Chloe, most clients don't come to you thinking they want to have a divorce that's going to take them 2 years to sort out and they're going to spend hundreds of thousands of pounds on legal fees.
Yeah.
So having a lawyer on the other side that you can have a sensible conversation with, for example, you might not be able to agree how to value a property, and the client's particularly set on some particular valuation method. Being able to call up and just have a chat through with things so that you can understand where the other side's coming from, what your client's point of view is, and then reach, hopefully, an agreement about it rather than letters going backwards and forwards and just increasing that acrimony and making it harder for clients to then step back and see the bigger picture.
Yeah. Agreed. And there's so much more that can be discussed when you're actually speaking on the phone rather than exchanging letters, right?
Well,
can
exactly.
have just a normal conversation and come to a solution.
And tone, isn't it? I mean, tone is so hard sometimes when you're writing. It can be really easy to put across the wrong message unintentionally to the other side. So having a conversation with somebody that you know, so that they might know then how to deal with that with their own client in a way that's going to come across better, because hopefully no one is trying to upset anybody. So being able to discuss that collaboratively is just so helpful.
And I guess also there's a value in the lawyers being less emotionally invested and being able to have more of a practical conversation focused on finding a solution. So that it's a bit of a filter between the two parties, isn't it?
It is a filter. And I think as well, if you get on with people and you know how they work, egos come out of it. So no one's trying to score points. No one's trying to appear better or stronger or smarter. They're actually just trying to find a solution for their clients.
Yeah. Absolutely. So can anybody share any example? I'm sure you've all had really good success stories that you can share of where you've done that. You picked up your phone or just had a conversation with the other side to resolve matters.
Shall I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
So many examples, but I think one thing that's really important to bear in mind is often that first communication that you have with the solicitor on the other side sets the tone for the whole case.
Yeah.
And if you are sending not even an aggressive letter, but you're sending a letter which doesn't have the right tone, or you're sort of jumping in with both feet, then it's very, very hard to row back from that later on. Yeah. And so very often the best way forward, in my experience, is, as Fran has alluded to pick up the phone. If it's someone you know, then you obviously know them already, so you've got a relationship. But actually, if it's not someone you know, just introduce yourself and realize that there's another human being on the other side of this case. And actually, I really like what you said at the beginning there, Chloe, about everybody working towards the same solution, because we are instructed by clients who are very often completely juxtaposed and polarized in terms of their positions. But actually, I always explore with my clients, well, what actually do we have in common?
Yeah.
with your spouse or former partner.
Hmm.
And actually there's quite a lot.
Hmm.
You both want to try and reach a resolution as swiftly and cheaply in terms of legal fees as
Hmm.
possible. You both want to protect the children as far as you can. You actually have quite a lot of things in common and shared goals. So before you become polarized, it's about
Yeah.
focusing on those similarities. And I'm sure Rachel's got lots of examples as well where I've had somebody be instructed by a client. Their partner has instructed a solicitor on the other side who I've worked with. And there's one in particular that I think of quite recently where actually we hardly exchanged any emails or letters at all throughout the case. We were
Yeah.
able to pick up the phone to each other. You don't then have issues about things getting lost in translation because
Yes.
if the solicitor says something, you can kind of pick them up on it, or you can
Yeah.
query, or you can say, but why is your client so fixated on wanting it to happen in this particular way? And there might be a really good reason for that.
Yeah.
And if you can drill down, then actually that cuts through a lot of the sort of unnecessary back and forth.
Absolutely. And actually, you touch on a really good point is, when you're trying to negotiate and not take, positions and end up in a positional bargaining situation, you need to understand what's behind the person's ask. And that only happens through conversations. And sometimes the parties just can't have those conversations directly. And then that's where having their lawyers being able to do it is particularly helpful.
And it's certainly not our job to add to that acrimony,
Mhm.
and certainly not for it to become personal between the lawyers.
Absolutely.
And actually, what you want are lawyers that are focused on outcomes and the final result rather than point scoring
That's
along the
right.
way. Because ultimately, one day these clients are going to leave us and they will be divorced and they will have a settlement and they will have to live with that. And we're
Absolutely.
not going to continue to be involved at that point. So we have a responsibility to ensure that we are not making things worse.
Yeah, absolutely. Rachel, any stories you'd like to share at your end?
Yeah, well, I completely agree. And I think one thing that comes out of the power of collaboration is getting to where you need to be much quicker than you would have done otherwise. And
Yeah.
also ironing out those little wild card points that are stopping you from having the conversation that you need to be having to get things
Hmm.
sorted. And I find that that often comes from things that you may think needs to be resolved via a
Hmm.
court order, but actually often it doesn't. So I
Hmm.
had quite a good example a little while back where we had a case and there were quite a few disclosure issues and
Hmm.
documents weren't being produced. And that can quite often lead to huge levels of mistrust,
Yeah.
particularly where one person has financial control over the documentation and the other doesn't. Um, but often it's for very simple, straightforward reasons that those documents haven't been provided.
Yeah.
And I can just think of one example where we had a very, very positive outcome by everyone just getting round the table and going through disclosure with laptops and logging in to accounts and getting the information that was needed that we couldn't find in a really, really effective and efficient way. And then
Hmm.
where a problem was encountered, actually, it was obvious that that problem was not as a result of the person trying to get the document. It was as a
Yeah.
result of various other reasons.
Yeah.
And that was quite transformative. I mean, the other thing is that it's transformative for us as well as lawyers to be trying these different solutions. And I think when you know the lawyer on the other side and you can trust them and you can pick up the phone and say, look, what do you think of this? Because this just might work for this particular case. Having that pre-existing relationship and trust there is really transformative and cost effective as well, because in another world where you maybe don't have that relationship, that
Hmm.
would be applications, you'd be at court, you'd get an order, and then you can't understand why the order's not being complied with, but
Yeah.
it's, and you go round and round in circles, and many thousands of pounds of costs will be incurred, including barristers' fees, which actually could have been resolved at an earlier stage. So that's just an example of how working together, I think, can really tackle issues that you wouldn't expect to
Yeah.
be tackled in that way.
I agree. And I think you mentioned something that resonates is, and I see it a lot with clients, as I'm sure you all do, is when there's no communication, there's assumptions being made and paranoia sometimes that sets in and a lot more distrust. And actually, as long as you're talking to each other, it may not be pleasant conversations, but if you're able to understand the other person's point of view, what they're doing, why they're not submitting documents, that sometimes, as you say, resolves the problem right there and then. But because when you're not talking, you assume they haven't sent that document because they're trying to hide information, etc. And again, that's where the lawyers have that step removed from the situation where they can have those conversations.
And
Yeah.
equally, Chloe, if following on from Rachel's example, rather than sitting down collaboratively and trying to sort it out, Rachel sent a really snotty letter being accused or accusing the other side of not having disclosed. Automatically, the ante's upped. You're feeding into those feelings of paranoia that perhaps your client has. You're not helping, and that's difficult. I'm not saying it's an easy thing always to manage what your client might be feeling at that moment, because they might be feeling really paranoid, or they might think, well, why aren't you sending that really aggressive letter? And that's when you need to step back. And that's your role, is to explain that actually going down this particular route might cost you, as Rachel's alluded to, thousands of pounds more, court, barristers. Let's try something more sensible. Let's see if we can sort this out without going that way.
Yeah.
And have you had
a...
Sorry, I was just going to jump in there, if that's okay, just on the aggression point, because I think often clients feel that aggression feels very powerful at the start of a case, but ultimately, good judgment is going to save you money and outcome. And I would just think very carefully when you're choosing your lawyer that you are choosing somebody for their judgment and not their aggression. The best lawyers, in my experience, the ones that I admire and respect and look up to and enjoy working with on cases, they're not the loudest, they're not the most confrontational. And I think aggression, sometimes clients think they want aggression, and I think some lawyers think they need to deliver that as well. And you learn from experience that that is not ultimately the best thing you can do for your client. So I think in terms of advice to clients, I think you have to be quite wary of lawyers who will tell you what you want to hear. And you need someone who's going to push back and ensure that just because you say, I want a lawyer who's going to be really aggressive, that doesn't say, fine, oh, we'll send some aggressive letters, because in 6 months' time, they'll have spent a lot of money, they won't have achieved anything, and you'll be even further away from settlement than you were at the outcome.
And so that's an interesting point, actually, in terms of from the client's perspective, when they're selecting a lawyer, what kind of things should they be looking out for to make sure that they are dealing with somebody that is going to be focused on a resolution and not make things worse?
I think that when you're first speaking to a solicitor, if there's another solicitor already on the other side, that is a really interesting point, because if you go to see a lawyer and they say, oh, they're terrible and they do this and they do that, I'm not sure that necessarily bodes very well for their approach to dealing with other family law professionals. So if I was a client and I was going to pick someone, I would want someone who could knowledgeably talk about practitioners, talk about cases they've done with other people and how they've been resolved, and are they prepared to look at other methods, as Rachel said, roundtable meetings or similar things where you're not immediately setting up an adversarial position. So I think really listening carefully to how they talk about other professionals and methods of resolving disputes.
I would ask if they've worked with the lawyer on the other side, if you know who that's going to be. I would ask how they typically resolve cases, and if you're speaking to somebody who is knowledgeable about the different ways of resolving cases outside of court and has experience in them, then that's going to be a green flag. You've got to be cautious of somebody whose default is simply to apply the same strategy to every single case, to issue court proceedings, and not to be able to think creatively. And I think the other thing that I would ask a lawyer is, how do they manage conflict if it is going to escalate unnecessarily? What is their advice going to be? What are their views on that? And what do they have in their toolbox in terms of how do they manage that situation?
I guess that requires an awareness that it's better not to be conflictual. And so what you were saying earlier, with those who actually think that they want or need, a bit of a shark approach, the lawyer plays a really important role actually in advising them and making sure that tensions are, brought down. And I think that's where I see a big difference, is the difference between a lawyer who's going to wind the client up and potentially also promise outcomes that are at the extreme end of what they could expect, versus those that are helping them stay realistic and keep their feet on the ground.
Yeah,
I mean,
and
that's
sorry, I was just going to jump in and say it's that confidence of speaking to a lawyer who's actually going to challenge some of those initial preconceptions of coming in and thinking, right, I want this.
Yeah.
And somebody who right at the outset is going to say, well, let's just think about what that's going to achieve. But also is going to explain the other options, because
Yes.
I often have clients that come in and they are quite specific about what they think they want to happen next. And they haven't thought really about mediation. Maybe they've thought, actually, mediation isn't appropriate for me for this suite of reasons. But they haven't considered hybrid mediation, or they haven't considered working with collaborative lawyers where you've got both your lawyers in the room with you all the way through the process. So if there is a power imbalance or if there is some concern there, you can get around those concerns about mediation not being something that's going to be appropriate for them. And also that misconception about what mediation is as well, that mediation is going to be like it is on the in the films, where in the US films mostly. And actually the reality is it's just going to be there to facilitate discussions, and you can still be supported by your lawyers in a collaborative way behind the scenes with a coming together in mediation, and it can really speed up some issues that you just can't get beyond without that mediator.
Yeah.
So just having somebody who's really knowledgeable about all of those processes and not just focusing in on, right, well, we could take this to court, we could make this application, because I think there is a temptation sometimes where you don't deal with lots of different collaborative out of court options to go through the motions in a case, because, well, right, what do we do first? Well, we issue proceedings and then we get disclosure and then we do this. But actually, you can consolidate all of that and get much quicker solutions for people by thinking outside the box and working in with those other options too. So I think that's what I would ask.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And the thing that we were saying earlier is having your own lawyer being in that mindset is great, but of course you can't control who the other person is
No,
instructing.
yeah.
And that's where you all play a role in knowing each other and building relationships of trust. And so how do you go about building those relationships aside from working on cases together?
Well, I mean,
Fran, maybe, or Kate.
part of it is repeated cases
Yeah,
and professional courtesy and consistency over time.
yeah,
I think it's important to ensure that you keep your word, that you're known as somebody who can be trusted, somebody who, obviously we're each working on our clients' instructions, but somebody who is going to be consistent in terms of the advice that they're given. And when I find out who the lawyer is on the other side and it's somebody I know, I can say to my client, I know what advice your wife is being given. I know the lawyer on the other side. I trust them. They are pragmatic. They are experienced. And this is what Fran or Rachel will be advising your wife, because it's what I would be advising.
yeah,
So they also know the advice that you're being given. So I think that's obviously important, and having that reputation for so far as you can. It's not possible in every case, but resolving issues proportionately and not performatively.
yeah.
I mean, we build networks through, having each other on the other side of cases, professional networks, training events, all those sorts of things. But really, it's just about doing your job and doing your job well and being consistent in terms of how you run your cases.
Yeah. And another thing I was thinking about is, like anybody, you guys change firms, right? You're not for necessarily for 50 years in the same place. And so having somebody who's a former colleague, that
Yeah.
could be quite an interesting insight as well when you're now at the other side of the problem with them. Has anyone had any kind of scenario like that?
Oh yeah.
I certainly have. And actually, I've got really, really strong networks with previous colleagues,
Yeah.
not just for cases where the relationship broken down, but also where you're agreeing the terms of the prenuptial agreement or a postnuptial agreement. And just having that personal knowledge, I'll always tell the client that, look, I know this person very well. I used to work with them. And it just helps frame everything in a more trusting way. And yeah, I can't I just think the power of having the trust in the person who you're working with can change the entire nature of what you're trying to negotiate. And there's that fear as well, isn't there, of, oh gosh, the lawyer on the other side. Is that a bad thing? Like, no,
Yeah,
it's
that's
wonderful. And we know the judge, and that's wonderful. And we know the barristers that are here as well. And that's powerful because we've all worked together. We've worked with them, we've had them on the other side of a case. And actually, we know that everyone here is going to be working professionally. So
yeah.
if I say hello to the solicitor on the other side, that's a great thing.
Yes.
And, we do that through as well. We're all members of Resolution, which, we meet regularly at conferences. We do training together. Often we've done our mediation training together, our collaborative law training together. So that really helps us all sort of reinforce that relationship, that we are all working towards that common goal, and we're all trained in the same skills and going to the same places as our colleague is going to.
Mm-hmm. And you make a good point, actually, that it's absolutely not in the client's best interest to have a lawyer who hates the other person's lawyer, who, don't get along, because actually that's not going to help find a solution, is it? It's just going to make things worse. It just doubles down on the conflict. Have any of you had an experience, the flip side of all of this, where it's gone particularly badly because there was no collaboration between the two lawyers, or because just there was an openness to discussing matters in a more fluid way than through correspondence? Fran, I see you nodding.
Unfortunately,
yeah,
yes.
Go on,
I mean, I think
I think we probably all have, haven't we?
We will all have had this.
Yeah.
And I think it comes back to a few points that have been made already, but I think it was Kate who mentioned that first correspondence, and you get that flavour for how someone is feeling about a case and how they're approaching a case. And actually, if you send that correspondence as your first port of call, that can really set things off on the wrong foot. And I think we've all had those really uber aggressive letters that were completely unnecessary, that then makes your client think you need to respond, and then you're managing your client and coming back to all the points we've discussed and talking about the fact that this isn't the best way to resolve it. There are many different options. The fact that perhaps they've just gone straight off to court for something without so much as a phone call, or trying to explore other ways of dealing with this. So yes, sadly, I have had quite a few experiences of that. My view is always, I will always behave in the same way. Like, I will always try to stay calm. I will always try to send reasonable letters. It's not my practice to send letters that I don't think are going to take a case forward. And I think when you get to know other lawyers, like we've talked about, who's likely to take that sort of approach, and sadly those who might not. But all you can do, I think, in these circumstances is keep putting forward reasonable solutions, keep giving your client good advice about what a reasonable outcome is, and trying to get things back on track and take the heat out as much as you can.
And that can be really challenging, actually, when the client's going to feel barrage of aggressive or point scoring type letters. And when you're saying, well, no, we're not going to be engaging with that, some clients sort of immediately understand why, and others get frustrated because they say, well, why is it okay for them to do it and it's not okay for us to do it? But ultimately, clients become entrenched because the lawyers are, and we have to be flexible, and we have to not apply the same rigid stance to every case. And I've seen many cases where lawyers have taken an overly aggressive stance, and that probably is led by their client. Not always, but sometimes it will be led by the client. But that then goes back to the point I was saying earlier, which is about when you're choosing your lawyer, the temptation to say, I want someone aggressive who's going to scare my husband. And ultimately, is that going to achieve the objective that you want to achieve here? It's very unlikely to do so. And really, the objective here is to minimise the correspondence, to hopefully avoid the need to go to court. If we do need to go to court, then reduce the necessity for extra hearings or sideshow battles, which ultimately don't move the case any further forward and just mean higher costs for everybody.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking there, actually, that about and reflecting on how things have changed enormously in, say, the last 5 years, because, historically, where you had cases, even if you had two very constructive lawyers on the other side, you might not be able to get through some points, and you'd end up falling back on the court system because you needed some assistance to resolve it. Now there are so many out of court options that the only reason I'm just thinking about this, but often the only reason is where there is a complete refusal to engage in out of court solutions with it. So, for example, if you're stuck on whether a business should be valued or not, you can now arbitrate that issue in a very straightforward way if you can't reach an agreement on it. And the same applies for private FDRs. We can where we get a judge to give an independent analysis on what the outcome might be if it went to court. That can really, really help speed up the processes of actually, this is the position of one party, this is the position of the other. We need someone to come together and just look at this and say, this is what the outcome should potentially be. So you instantly minimize that court-based positional piece that we have historically and have had to engage in to get solutions. So I think where you have an interest and a commitment to out of court options from both solicitors and your communication's good, you're most likely to get a good and fair outcome quicker. And that's hugely been benefited from the new, but from this encouragement of all to deal with out of court options.
Yeah. And I think, I spend a lot of time coaching people on how to select the right lawyer, because a lot of my clients come to me before they even, instruct anyone. And one of the questions I recommend is asking, do they know the other person's representation if they've been appointed? And it's something that people don't think of. I don't think, if you haven't had the experience of this, it's not a natural question. So I think that's kind of one of the big takeaways from our conversation today for our listeners is ask those questions. And yes, it is to your benefit. Even if they're best friends, actually, even more if they're best friends, it will be to your benefit, because actually, if there's trust between the lawyers, even if there's no trust between the parties, there is a possibility there of having, decent conversations and finding an agreement.
Yeah, and speaking to each other and saying, do our lawyers know each other, and should they? Should we be looking to do this sort of in a way where actually we're going to have two people that are going to work together? Because that can be quite a powerful conversation to have at the beginning.
That would be ideal, wouldn't it? If couples could at least agree on that.
and I think don't be scared of familiarity, because familiarity allows firmness and trust without hostility. So actually, it's not a weakness at all. It's actually a superpower, because then you can cut through so much. You can all focus on that outcome, and as you say, that trust, the trust that has most likely broken down between our clients. Let's reflect that between the lawyers as well.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I think that's a great way to wrap up. Actually, very, very good point. Thank you all, ladies, for joining me today. It was a very interesting conversation, and I'm sure it will help a lot of people in their own selection of a lawyer, and also in figuring out how they can find agreements with a bit less conflict in the process. So thank you all very much, and have a lovely day.
Thank you, Chloe.
Thanks, Chloe.
Chloe.